So welcome. We're going to talk about positive behavior support today and positive behavior support plans. And we'll talk a little bit about, first of all, about Matrix Parents Network before we get into the actual content of the presentation. So at Matrix, we empower families of children with special needs to successfully understand and access the systems that serve them. We want you to become successful advocates and role models for your children. What we're about is educating and providing information and skills to parents, and also strategies about becoming the best advocate you can be for your child. Just keep in mind that we're not attorneys or advocates. We don't actually represent you with school districts. We help you to become an advocate. We're here to help you develop your advocacy skills, and we'll help you strategize pre and post IEP. We can problem solve school issues and help you develop a positive relationship with your IEP team. We do not give legal advice or advise a course of action. We provide support and information to help parents learn about their rights and options, find referrals and resources, and help parents become the best advocate they can be for their child. All right, so let's talk just for a second about who your presenters are today. My name is David. I'm a parent advisor with Matrix. I've been with Matrix about a year and a half. I am the grandparent of a beautiful young girl with autism. I'm also a retired director of special education, and I worked in the education field for many years and in special ed. So one of the things I did was worked as a behaviorist for some number of years, and I'm quite comfortable with the positive behavior support section of our training. And also here with me is Birgit. And Birgit is another parent advisor with Matrix, and she's been with Matrix for a number of years. So we're both parent advisors. All right. So let's talk about the goal of this training. Is to provide you with a basic understanding of positive behavior support theory. And the reason that it's important that you know that theory is because we're going to provide you information about the components of a behavior intervention plan. What happens is that behavior intervention plans are written roadmaps, basically a PBS theory. And so positive behavior support is the basis of behavior intervention plans in schools. Understanding the theory is going to help you much better understand the components of a positive behavior support plan. Let's talk about some typical behaviors. And I want to stress, first of all, that there are no behaviors that are exactly alike for children. So these are not descriptors. They're simply names of some behaviors that we talk about. So some of those are aggression towards others, self-harm, noncompliance, things like refusing to do work or listen to directions, eloping, which is running away, self-stimulation, ritualistic behaviors. Those are behaviors for kids, for instance, with autism, like flapping and things of that sort, and tantrums. So those are a few of them. Again, the problem with that is that they're not descriptive. What they are labels that talk about what a behavior is. What we need to do is that we need to get way beyond those labels and look at exactly what the behavior consists of. And even observation is not enough to do this. We need to look at the behavior. We need to take data at all points along the way when the behavior is occurring. And that includes before, the things leading up to it, the behavior itself, and then what happens after the behaviors. And so we take data along all those points and we determine what interventions we're going to use, and then we determine what interventions work. So having a label for a behavior is helpful in some ways, but it's not nearly enough. So let's look at a definition of positive behavior support. And there's a million of them online, but this is one that I particularly like. This one is a set of research-based strategies used to increase quality of life and decrease problem behavior by teaching new skills and making changes in a person's environment. So when we talk about positive behavior support, we talk not only about teaching skills, we also talk about environmental changes, which is an important part that we're going to get into more here in a minute. First to understand is that problem behaviors don't occur in a vacuum. There's always a legitimate reason for the behavior. I can promise you that kids with disabilities don't display problematic behaviors just to ruin your day. In fact, that's very little goes into the calculation of a behavior when a child is displaying it. There's nothing vindictive in the underlying need. Now, there may be something vindictive in the way the behavior looks, or there may be, the misbehavior is unpleasant to begin with, but that underlying need, there's nothing vindictive about that. There's nothing, dark about it. It's simply a need that a child has. So while an actual behavior can range from annoying to dangerous, it's important to keep in mind that there is a legitimate need being expressed. Behaviors are communication. A child is letting people in their environment know that they have a need and are communicating the need as best they can. Once we get past that idea that a behavior is an act of willful defiance, that it's a way for a child to get a need met that they don't have any other means to get that need met, then we can start looking at behaviors from an objective viewpoint. The problems with reacting to behaviors in a negative way is that the child frankly doesn't care unless you're supplying something to them that helps them get their need met. So your reaction, be it punishment, be it ignoring, whatever it might be, is immaterial to the child in terms of getting their need met. They're going to continue to get that need met regardless of your response, unless it's a planned response. So once we have a reason determined, so that's what we're trying to do, is that we are trying to determine the reason for the behavior. What is that underlying need? Once we determine that, then we can come up with, first of all, invent or come up with a replacement behavior for that behavior we don't want to see, as long as the child is continuing to get their need met. We have to define the function of a behavior in order to select an appropriate replacement behavior. If we misidentify the reason for the behavior, then the original behavior is going to continue because there's no need being met for the child by the replacement behavior. The replacement behavior includes ways for the child to communicate their needs more effectively, and communication is the key. Once we understand this, then the behavior starts to lose its power over both the student and ourselves, because we understand it for what it is. The environment, like we talked about, needs to be modified or changed to eliminate triggers, things that will make it more likely that the behavior is going to occur. So PBS emphasizes modifying the environment so that the opportunity for the problematic behavior is minimized. Eventually, the student can be taught to control their own environment. So there may be a need that the child is exhibiting that's going to be a lifetime need. What happens is that, first of all, the child needs to learn replacement behaviors, but they also need to know how to minimize the triggers within their own life that may bring at least these feelings up that have led to those behaviors. Coping strategies are taught to empower the child to help reduce the need for the behavior. We teach coping strategies such as stress management, and what we try to do is to help students self-manage the stress that's in their life. That's a valuable life skill. They're, kids, regardless of disability, are going to feel stress in their life just like everyone else. In fact, sometimes greater stress. And so it's important to have those skills to be able to reduce that. Some behaviors are neurologically based and may not respond to teaching of replacement behaviors. Teaching and reinforcing coping strategies, though, if a child can't learn a replacement behavior, is very important. So what we try to do is that we teach coping strategies, we change the environment for children that can't learn those replacement behaviors. And what we're talking about are usually intransigent problems like, I'll give you an example of Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a neurological disorder that the child is missing a gene that basically controls their appetite. And while there are a lot of other issues that come with the disability, the fact that the appetite is the most noticeable part of that. So this is not something a child can control. So what we need to do in that case is control the environment strictly, and then teach the child strategies that they could use when they get in a situation where food becomes available. And with those kids, we do realize that they may not be able to learn those replacement behaviors. Okay, most important. And if you come away with nothing more from this training, punishment does not work. And I promise you, from my long experience having both my own children and having worked as a teacher for children with emotional disturbances and having worked as a behaviorist, I can personally guarantee you that punishment doesn't work. And it's a very simple reason for it. But I will say that punishment can succeed for a short period of time. It's just in the long run, it's simply going to reinforce the behavior you're trying to get rid of. What we talked about before is that if you're not replacing something that gets that need met, it's not going to work. And what punishment actually does is reinforce that behavior, so it makes it more difficult. So that's it's a tough one to get across, but punishment doesn't work, and you'll find that as you're going along if you haven't understood that already. All right, so let's go into now what an actual behavior plan includes. And again, I want to emphasize that positive behavior support, the components of that, are at the base of all of these BIPs. So what we're looking at in the behavior plan is an accurate description of the behavior. Remember, we talked about those examples of behaviors, but they're not actually descriptors of the behavior. So we don't want to see, Mary acts out, Mary throws a tantrum. We want to say, Mary throws pencils from her desk, doesn't aim at them at anyone, and she'll do that when. And so we want that accurate description, not just a name for it. Okay, the next thing is that we need an analysis for the reason of the behavior, and we're going to get into in a couple of minutes here the most accepted reasons for behaviors when we're looking at replacement behaviors. We'll talk about that in a minute. We have to identify the pro-social replacement behavior. What is it going to look like that we want the child to do instead of the problematic behavior that they've been displaying? We have to have a plan to re-encourage or reinforce the replacement behavior. Just like you go to work and get a paycheck, students go to school and get the satisfaction of grades, or they get, whatever the reinforcers they have. Is the same with behaviors, that they're to see the behavior really take hold. We need to provide replacement, but not only replacement behavior, but to be able to provide those kind of reinforcements for that. Okay. They also include instructions on how to ignore or minimize the old problem behavior, what to do if the old problem behavior reappears, and how the environment will be modified and what coping skills will be taught. We have to recognize that the old behavior is not going to go away permanently overnight. It's going to pop up with some regularity over time before eventually going away. So that's the part about instructions of how to ignore or minimize the old behavior. We don't want to reinforce it, remember, by giving it more attention than it deserves. We want to minimize it because we don't want to see that behavior. What we do want to see is the new behavior, but we have to have plans of what to do if the old one comes up. So that's the first bullet. The second one, what to do if the old problem behavior reappears. We have to have a plan, because that behavior is going to come up. How do we minimize the power of that behavior over both the child's environment and over themselves? And then how are we going to modify the environment, and what coping skills will be taught? And we've talked about those in the past, about not having those opportunities, those triggers available for the child to have to experience, and also teaching them coping skills so that they can avoid, not only avoid the triggers, but to withstand them when they occur. All right. So let's look at levels of support to address problem behaviors. And the reason we talk about this is that we don't want to overreact to a behavior. What we want to do is to provide that level of support that addresses the behavior, but not so much that it becomes the point of what we're doing with the child. There's, depending on the seriousness of it, we'll respond to it with a particular level. So levels of support depend on the seriousness, duration, and intensity of the behavior. The IEP team needs to decide how serious a behavior it is, and then to identify what the response is going to be. The intervention should reflect how interfering the behavior is to a child's ability to access their education and interact successfully for their environment. When we talk about that response, again, we don't want to get it we don't want to have an inappropriate level of response, either too low or too high, because what it then starts to do is itself it interferes with a child's ability to get their education. All right. So the first level is having a goal only. A lot of times goals are adequate to address a behavior that is minimally interfering and the purpose is well understood. If we know why a child is doing something, and let me give you just a really easy example of this. We have John, who is a third grader who refuses to raise his hand and speaks out in class all the time. How serious is that behavior for John, and how serious is it for his environment? Well, if it's the kind of thing that if the teacher is reminded to remind John to raise his hand, and that's the purpose of the goal, that John will respond to a prompt by a teacher to appropriately raise a hand and ask a question. If that's going to address the issue, then having that goal is fine. What it is a reminder to the staff that are working with the student that this is what is being worked on and this is how we're doing it. Again, it has to be where the purpose is understood. John may be not raising his hand because he wants attention. And so if we understand that attention is the reason for that, then possibly a goal is going to be enough. Possibly a goal and a behavior plan is going to be needed. So that's adequate for more interfering behaviors where the purpose of the behavior is clear. So if we have a behavior where, John is not only not raising his hand and calling out, but he's getting up and wandering around the classroom and talking to other students during class, it could be that that's a more serious and interfering behavior for John and for the classroom. And if we understand that it's still attention that he's trying to get, we may want to write a behavior plan that more formally addresses how to go through those parts of positive behavior support that will make the behavior less likely. Those things like, having that replacement behavior ready, having the reinforcers ready, and so on, those other components. Okay. The highest level that we go in terms of a behavior plan is something called a functional behavior analysis that leads to a behavior intervention plan. Actually, there's two terms. There's a functional behavior assessment, which is a less formal one, and then a functional behavior analysis, which is a more formal, and that's the highest level of behavior support that we provide. These are four serious behaviors that require a data-driven approach. So we may have a behavior is very complex. We may have a child, for instance, that, let's say, is nonverbal, and they're having some very complicated behaviors that we just don't understand, what the antecedents, what the triggers are. We don't understand what the purpose of the behavior is. And so we're going to need to have someone who's an expert in this come in and take some careful data. And then we can come up with a theory of what's going on with the behavior. And then we can write a behavior plan from that. So the FBA is a formal process that requires an assessment plan. It goes through the same timeline that a regular assessment does, which is 60 days. And it's just a more analytical, a more scientific way of looking at the behavior. Okay. We're talking about implementing positive behavior support goals and BIPs. And I have to say, I've attended about 2,000 IEP meetings in my career when I worked as a coordinator for many years for a school district. And what I've seen too often in behavior plans is that they're not implemented, or they're not implemented fully. And positive behavior support is not, it's a theory, but it's also been proven scientifically for over the last 50 or 60 years. And so there's no question that the components of positive behavior support work. The problem is that if it's not implemented with fidelity, if it's not implemented completely, then the behavior plan is just a piece of paper. And not only that it be implemented completely, but it be implemented consistently and over time. The old problematic behavior is not going to go away. And we talked about this in a predictable straight line. And what happens a lot of times is that the staff, even experienced behaviors, will start to lose faith in the behavior plan. And we're going to talk about here in a minute that there's actually a name for this, and we'll get into that. But we have to be prepared for the fact that this is not going to go away right away, that there's going to be bumps in the road, and that we have to implement the plan as it's written. And if we're going to change it, the team has to be on board with what that change is so we can continue to collect accurate data. Okay. So the next few slides are not part of, well, they are part of positive behavior support, and they really are part of behavior plans, but they're things that you're not going to see actually on the behavior plan, but they're things to keep in mind that are important parts when you're writing one, or when you're looking at one. So let's look at some commonly used reasons for behaviors, and these are used in both scientific literature and in practice. And these are the ones that you'll see 95% of the time when you're looking at behavior plans. The behavior we're talking about for a plan will originate with one of these reasons. The first one is escape. And by the way, these are not in any particular order, although escape and attention are probably the two most commonly used. They're the two that are most commonly observed. So they're used as reasons a lot of times when they're not actually the reason. So they will get into that a little bit. But so we talk about escape, and escape is anything that could be something that overwhelms the student, so they have to get out of the situation. That's usually what it is, that it's a problem of just too much stimuli coming in, and the child has to escape. Attention, and that's what we talked about, the child possibly the reason that they don't raise their hand and they're wandering around the room talking to other students. Sensory issues. Now, when I talked about escape a minute ago, I said there may have been too much stimuli in the environment. So you see, we talk about these reasons, but there's pretty nuanced differences between them, because that stimuli in the environment could be sensory, and it could be that escape is what the action is, but the actual reason is sensory. So again, I don't want to get too complicated with it, but it's not an easy thing to figure out sometimes. Power and control is one that is being used more and more these days, and it's one that I think is a real important one. A lot of times our kids with special needs don't feel a lot of power in their lives. And in particular for them, they feel the need to take control of their environment more so than other kids a lot of times. And so they may perform an act that is actually just them controlling the situation that they're in some way. And then the last one we talk about are tangibles, which is a physical thing that a child is going to want. Okay, we have to talk about data and record keeping. And again, with my experience in the field, this is one of the areas that I felt that educators fall down, is keeping accurate data. And as a parent, it's very important for you to know that data is being taken on a behavior plan, because we don't know where we are without it. Without data, like it says, we are a rudderless behavioral ship. And we need to have objective data, as we talked about, not tantruming as being a description of the behavior, but an actual description of the behavior. And that'll include the severity of it, the frequency, and the duration. And without, again, that data, we're not going to be able to tell if a behavior is improving or a behavior plan is working. All right. And observation alone doesn't do the job. Just one more point on that. We need data collection along with that observation. Let's talk about prompts just for a minute. This is a really important part of implementing a behavior plan, but one of which you may not be that familiar with, or if you are, that how important they really are. The idea is to use whatever kind of prompt is necessary, and those can take really any kind of form. It could be for a child that is more involved, has more involved disability, maybe a tap on the shoulder. It could be eye contact. It could be a sign on a desk. It could be a teacher, a teacher saying something. But the idea is that with prompting, we want to use it while it's effective, and only as long as we absolutely have to use it, because what we want to do is we want to fade. We want to get rid of those prompts as quickly as possible, so that that child can independently display that behavior we're trying to see. Okay. Fading, we just talked about this a minute ago. It's really important that we fade, that we get rid of, that we slowly eliminate the supports that a child is getting, because what we want them to see, what we want them to do, is display that replacement behavior independently. We want to see them display it without us having to do anything with that. So any of these things, reinforcers, the prompts, any of these, we want to get rid of them, but we want to do them in a way that is supportive of the child. So we don't do it right away. We do it gradually. Okay. And then just following in these next few slides are just a few other important concepts that you should keep in mind when you're looking at behavior plans. All BIPs, all behavior plans, should be strength-based. All of our kids have strength. If we focus on incorporating those, we're going to be much better off, because they're going to be able to employ things that that they use, that they are going to be able to use in their life to be able to make these changes. And this is consistent throughout an IEP. This is not just in a behavior plan. Throughout an IEP, we want to look for what a child's strengths are. And then we want to be able to build on those and not just look at those negative aspects. We want to use those strengths to be the main building blocks. Okay. Successful BIPs need a team. One person is not responsible for implementing a BIP. Everyone who comes in regular daily contact with a child should be aware of the BIP and how to consistently follow it. What I want to emphasize here first is that a parent, although you're an integral member of the BIP or an integral member of the IEP team, you are not a person responsible for implementing a BIP. As just with any other part of an IEP, it's the staff, it's the professionals that are responsible for implementing it. So I wanted to make that clear. But a BIP can't just be one person at school. What happens if the child displays the problematic behavior on the playground, when they're at lunch, when they're in the hallway going from one class to another? Everybody. And there's something called school-wide positive behavior support that's being used now, where everybody on a school campus is trained generally in positive behavior support, including people like custodians and people in cafeterias. And so that's the kind of level of training that people need to have, that they should know that a child has a behavior plan, generally what's in it, and at least not how to exacerbate the problem, at least how to de-escalate any kind of issues that come up. It really is a team effort. Okay. BIPs are not standardized, and this is true as in anything in special education. Our kids are unique, and there is no one size fits all. We have to go back to the need for accurate data collection to drive what we're doing, instead of having a kind of a format that we use in the positive behavior intervention plans. We really have to look at the underlying need and to write the plan from that. All right, so this is really the purpose of special education, the purpose of teaching children how to behave or to learn or anything. It's the same for special education, for any other service, that a child gets the service in order to become independent. What we want to see are our children being independent, successful adults that are able to speak out for themselves. And so that's the reason that we fade things as quickly as we can, that we remove supports as quickly as we can, in a way that they can then display their independence and self-advocacy. One of the things that we're trying to emphasize at Matrix, I think, over this last year, and we're emphasizing now, is independence and self-advocacy for our kids. And it's just vital that they learn that, so that they can go into adulthood and have the best chance that they can to success. All right, the child and you are not responsible for your BIP. A positive behavior, PBS is about teaching, and we should treat behavior intervention plans in the same way. This is about teaching students how to behave, not for them to be able to teach themselves how to behave. Kids don't teach themselves math or reading. We shouldn't expect them to teach themselves something as complicated as their own behaviors. I still see behavior support plans and goals that are written with a child responsible, and that's just not correct. Kids should never be responsible for their own services. They're the student, not the teacher. This is an important one, and this is one that everybody forgets about too often. Approximating success. What that means is that kids don't behave in exactly the way the BIP envisions right away. It's not going to happen. We've talked about this frequently in these past slides, that we're not going to see our kids go from 0 of having awful behaviors to 100% having perfect behaviors at any point, and particularly not overnight. It's really critical that we reinforce and celebrate partial success. Let me give you just a very simple example of that, again, with John not raising his hand. So we have a behavior plan in place for John, and the teacher knows that when John doesn't raise his hand, she's going to try to ignore that. Or when John raises his hand and he does it perfectly, that she's going to reinforce that. But what about that time when John raises his hand at the same time, goes, ooh, I have the answer? So he's still disrupting the class, He's doing the same thing was before, but he's got his hand up at the same time. I argue that that's success, and that child needs to be reinforced pretty heavily at that point for succeeding. John, you did great. You got, almost all the way there. And the next thing you need to do is, get that hand up there without saying anything. So we have to celebrate those times when our kids are doing better. And the reason for that is that we have to get kids to know what it viscerally, what it feels like inside their body for that behavior to occur. John has to know when he raises his hand and he doesn't say anything, that has to be a feeling in there. Okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. And those needs are that deep to where a child has to feel that, not just get it intellectually, but get it at a gut level. Okay, behavior spikes. This is something that happens. In fact, research shows that if you are identifying a reason for a behavior correctly, okay, you're going to get what's called a behavior spike or a series of behavior spikes. And all that means is that when you first put a behavior plan into place, what happens a lot of time, they call it a honeymoon period. And that's true in special ed and a lot of things, but they call this a honeymoon period. What happens is that the behavior gets better in a real hurry. The child's, getting reinforced, they're getting rewarded for things going on. Everybody's happy. And all of a sudden the behavior goes back to what it was, or worse than what it was at the beginning. And what happens at a lot of times, particularly with inexperienced people, is that they start to lose confidence in the plan. But what research is showing that a behavior spike happens in the great majority of cases where the reason for the behavior selected is the correct reason. And there's technical reasons for this that we won't go into. So there's research on it, which is actually pretty interesting if you'd ever want to read it. But what has to happen at this point is that the team needs to stay the course. They need to keep that behavior plan in place. And eventually, hopefully what will happen is that those spikes will become less and less. And eventually what happens if the correct behavior is selected, that behavior will go to zero at some point in the future. And it doesn't mean the actual behavior may go away, but the reason that the child was selecting that behavior is going to go away. So they may use that behavior for another reason at some point in the future, but John not raising his hand to get attention is not going to be the reason for that behavior in the future. And it really works that completely. Now we have to talk about antecedent and behavior and consequences, the ABCs. You may find on behavior plans that people will talk about the ABCs when they talk about an antecedent, which is what happens before the behavior occurs. And these are those times we're talking about getting involved environmentally to reduce those triggers. The antecedents are the triggers that we were talking about. The second part of the ABC is the actual behavior. And what happens during that behavior? How does the antecedent affect it? If we change the antecedent, does that then modify the behavior? And then the last part is the consequence. And it's important at this point to realize that a consequence is not a punishment. A consequence is what naturally happens as the result of the behavior. So we may have a child that has a behavior plan that if they display the old behavior and it's not overly interfering, that the consequence for displaying that behavior is that the teacher is going to ignore them, is going to ignore that behavior. So that ignoring is not a punishment. It's simply the reaction that the team has decided that they're going to display if the child displays that behavior under certain conditions. So it's a pre-planned response that is designed to eliminate the behavior and promote the replacement behavior. There really needs to be consistency between home, school, and even the community. A child's going to learn faster and more efficiently if the same plan is used as much as possible in all settings. Now, again, you're not responsible for implementing that behavior plan at school, but if you're using the same type of reinforcers, the same type of response to the behavior at home and in the community, the child's going to learn just much faster that this is the behavior that's expected in all settings, and it's going to reinforce it much easier for the child. It also means that you need to stay in pretty close contact with schools, particularly with behavior plans, in my opinion. The reason for that, if a behavior plan is not implemented correctly at the beginning, the whole behavior program can be in trouble pretty quickly. And if you don't know that within a period of weeks, really, then it can become a problem. So what I suggest for parents is that in the first part of the year in particular, if there's a behavior plan in place, that you keep in close communication with the staff and to really oversee that behavior plan to make sure what's happening with it. Okay. And patience speaks for itself. We've talked about the fact that you're going to see behavior spikes and that this is not a smooth path. There will be setbacks. Keep following the plan. And what's most important is that changes only be instituted with data being used, and that the whole team is involved with any major changes in a behavior plan. The reason for that is that if people are kind of nibbling around the edges and making changes, even small ones in behavior plans, then the data can be skewed if it's not taking into account that change that was made. So as much as possible to have a consistent intervention, that way the data is going to be much more accurate. So, and just the last time with that, many times behavior is going to be more difficult to teach because what you're doing is that you're dealing with an old behavior and teaching a new behavior. So you're not starting with a blank slate. You're starting with something that's already existing there that you're trying to eliminate. And so it's a tricky thing to do, but with patience and with knowing how to do this, we can make a real change in the behaviors of our children. So Birgit is going to present a behavior plan. That's a real behavior plan. It's a very good one, and we'll see if these components are all included in it. Okay, so Birgit.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. So you'll have this behavior plan in your packet. So we have Blake here. He's a 14-year-old boy with intellectual delay and autism. He, like his other peers, has target behaviors. So here on this slide, we have identified aggression, bolting, noncompliance, and verbal output. So that's the target. Here's how often it happens, how frequent it happens, and what the function of it is. So for the aggression, it happens 1 to 5 seconds, 2 times a day for escape. Bolting 5 to 30 seconds with 3 times a day. Again, function is escape. Non-compliance, which is 10 to 30 minutes, 4 times a day with escape. And then verbal output, which is high shrieking, 1 to 30 minutes, 5 times a day. And that's very sensory related. So here we have a good sense of what the target behaviors are, how often they're happening, how many times they're happening, and what the function is behind it. Next slide. So here's what we found out through the BFA, that sensory every 2 hours is something that is helpful for him. So there's a sensory diet that he has in his environment that he goes to help him get that sensory feedback he needs, that he's engaged in fully participating in the activity, that he needs a calm environment, that he needs to have what we call the pre-MAC principle, which is if we do this now, then this will happen. So the behavior present will lead to the next behavior. So kind of the cause and effect. Allowing him to have preferred activities within his non-preferred activities, alternating space, and this means being inside, being outside, sitting, standing. How can he use his gross motor to get himself to a self-regulating place? So is that putting him on a trampoline? Is that taking him out for a walk? Is that using an adaptive bike? These kind of things. Also, how you're standing with him. Are you standing over him? Are you standing next to him? Are you spacing yourself away? Because that proximity, being too close, may trigger one of those behaviors. And also looking at having preferred staff and then having consistent response to the behavior. So the speech therapist, the occupational therapist, the paraprofessionals, the teacher, they're all using a consistent response to the trigger behavior and using that BIP plan as it's written. And then having alternate communication system. Much of the behavior happens around the fact that he has delayed communication. So is that using picture icons? Is that using pictograms? Is that using pointing? So communication is not just words, it's how one uses the environment in order to be able to communicate your needs. So again, communication boards are great. Pictograms are great. You know, him pointing to things that he wants, him leading you to things that he wants. That's kind of the communication skill that we see for him here. What things are not helpful? Well, his behavior is awfully not great when he's hungry or thirsty. Definitely, he wants to be able to move the way he wants. So when he's told that he has to wait or move in a certain way, that triggers behavior. Having transitions are really hard for a lot of kids, going from one thing to the other, because a child may want to keep doing the activity, but then is required to shift out of that activity. And then always being that kind of space proximity we're talking about, being physically prompted by either touching his arm or pushing him or cueing him in a physical way, or being blocked from going where he wants to go or doing the activity that he wants. So these are things that are not helpful. So in the BIP, you'll see that he is getting all these services. He has a special day class. He is also in the general community, and this is the frequency of when he's in these different things and how many minutes. Instructional assistance, which is again, general ed, speech, language, speech, occupational therapy, and special education teacher. And here I want to emphasize, you see, that is a team approach. It's not one person responsible. It's all the team members that are working with him that are responsible for it. So I think that is a good thing to note. Again, there's no one isolated person who is making the BIP work for him. It's this whole team instructing him how to be able to access his environment using socially appropriate behavior. So here we have the replacements for the escape, which is aggression and bolting and noncompliance. He has a particular communication skill system, sorry. So that's, you know, using pictograms, using visual schedule, alternating his activities, and then increasing his tolerance to non-preferent activities. So allowing him to do the activity for 10 minutes versus the full 20 minutes with a 5-minute break, and then regrouping. Whatever this looks like is again, how do we measure the time that he's able to tolerate and then increase that time with these non-preferred activities. So bolting in this case is he gets his attention strays, he wants to go where he wants to go, and this is his control and his power. So instead of doing the activity, asking him what he wants, like how can you make a request before actually doing the movement? Again, a time a time of how to increase his tolerance for waiting. Is that 5 minutes? Can we increase that to 10? Increase that to 15? Now, tolerance for waiting is very different from activity to activity. If someone isn't invested in the activity, then obviously the waiting is much shorter because they want to get to the activity. If it's something he doesn't want, there's a little bit more procrastination in this. And then this PREMAC in principle, if you do this, then this will happen. So in this case, it could be like, if you are able to use a little voice, then you'll get a star. And so using a token system here could reinforce this if then scenario. So here's a sensory, which is a verbal output. It happens a lot. And so this team is the OT and the special ed teacher and the speech language therapist looking at what self-regulatory strategies we can use, using a little voice and that leading to a positive response. Again, chewies is another thing. So what sensory diet can he use to bring out this output down, because he needs that sensory feedback. So chewies, things that he can manipulate with his hands, manipulatives, that could be fidgets, that could be things that he squeezes, that could be you know, particular weighted vests or weighted blankets. How is he getting that sensory feedback so that behavior is going down, because that's really the purpose of that behavior. So again, here are the reactive strategies. Again, this is all kind of same thing. Communication system is one of the biggest thing, because he has such language deficits. That's something that the whole team is working on. Also, can you ignore the behavior? And if you ignore that behavior will decrease because he's not getting the attention he needs. He's not getting from the environment, which is causing the reinforcement of that behavior. Then these, again, breaks that we're talking about, sensory strategies. So if that break means him being out of the classroom for 5 minutes, so be it, right? And then regrouping. So taking a kid out of the classroom with a purpose in mind is not a bad thing. But if you take that kid out of the classroom for the purpose of trying to isolate that child, that is not a good strategy because it's not teaching them anything. Again, with bolting, these physical prompts, the behavior stops, again, if then, waiting to calm. So if you go for a walk and he starts doing a behavior, stopping him saying, well, keep going when you're ready. And show me what your voice needs to be, those things. And then as a result, giving him access to preferred activities. Again, sensory, a lot of these behavior stops is that go to your sensory box, get what you need to get your sensory input that you need. And, again, prompting, use your little voice. So, there's icons that show what too much of a voice is and what appropriate voice is. So using those kind of icons as well. So again, I'm talking about this token economy. So there is, again, the ability to give him a star chart. And if you meet so many stars, then he gets a reward. In the case of Blake, he needs a more of a token or more immediate than having them be added up. So, if he does a good thing, then he gets a small token of positivity. Also increasing his preferred activities among the non-preferred activities. And then also reinforcing him with verbal praise. You did a great job. Your voice was perfect. You used a little voice, how good that was. So again, as much verbal praise and prompting on top of token economy makes Blake be able to meet some of those goals within the IEP. So again, it's, as you can see, there's multiple ways for reinforcement. There are multiple people involved in the BIP. The BIP that you have and the functional behavior analysis you have, it is lengthy, but it's the best well-written one I've seen in a long time, because it really does cover all those areas of what is the behavior, the ABCs, how often it happens, what the frequencies is, and the appropriate reinforcement. Now, the BIP, like the IEP, is looked at every year, unless it needs to be looked at more often. And in case of Blake, a BABC is always on consult, so that if there's a spike in these behaviors, they figure out why that is. And if they need to, they can change it. But I can tell you that this BIP is written in such a way that there haven't been much changes made. It's been consistent about what they need to do. And again, Blake's behavior changes from day to day. There's some very good days, there's some not very good days. So, and I know this because this is my child. So just for that purpose. So we're at our end of our case study. Again, if you have the time, read his behavior plan. It really is well written. It doesn't make him be responsible for the change in behavior. It really looks at the team, helping him get the skills and using the environment in such a way that he's getting what he needs without the socially inappropriate behavior. And so I think it's a good example of what a good BIP looks like.
What I like about this behavior plan is that everything in it, the prompts are defined, the fading is defined, and so they don't just put fading or prompts, and everything is listed in the way they do it. So it's specific in that way, which I really like.